Hello and welcome to the Deep Sea Podcast, a punk take on a science podcast about everything deep sea. I'm Dr. Thomas Lindley. With me, as ever, is the Professor, Alan Jameson. How, mate?
Good evening, Tom.
Good evening. Start us off with the soundtrack. What's been playing in your head?
Absolutely nothing. Just complete and utter silence. It's been such a horrific 2 or 3 weeks, so I'm void of all joy.
It's just white noise.
Yeah, for all sorts of reasons. So I'm going to throw on that back at you. What have you been listening to?
Oh, well, as may be revealed later, I have recently discovered we build spaceships.
Oh, that sounds like a curious link to something coming up in the show.
Well, it was an unusual place where I discovered this music. So, we'll find out where that comes from later. Apologies first for the COVID-riddled last episode. It was a bit tough. It was tough to record and it was tough to edit. So thanks for hanging in there. And I'm very sorry if that was your first ever episode, was me like groaning into a microphone and then not having the energy to do a very good job at editing. But thanks for hanging in there.
I couldn't tell the difference, Tom.
That, I don't know how to take that. That might be good.
I'm gonna leave that one just floating around. But
yeah,
I must admit, I thought my audio was terrible in the last one. There was just
you were out in your cupboard. You were out in the real world. And yeah, that was. I think that was in your living room.
Yeah,
you just need to go back into your scolding little fort.
Yes, the problem I've got at the moment is I'm living in a self-made man cave fort behind my sofa because of this COVID in the house. And I'm supposed to fly to Japan on Monday morning, so I'm desperately trying not to. It's over now, actually. To be fair, it's I'm allowed out again, but I have been squatting in my own house.
This feels like alien isolation. It feels like COVID is actually like a 7-foot tall beast, and you're hiding behind the sofa as it prowls around the house looking for you.
Yeah.
Looking for the uninfected.
It's funny, like when someone has COVID, you don't even want to look them in the eye, just in case.
In case the eye beams carry it.
Yeah, just like get back into your dungeon. Don't come out.
Unclean. Yeah. Bring back leper colonies, I say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
While I'm moaning about editing, just a reminder that we have started releasing our pressurized version of these episodes. So if you don't have enough time for an hour and 20 minutes of us rambling on, then we just whip out the best bits in a 15 to 20 minute long version of the episodes. So following each major episode, there'll be the condensed version of them. But we're also going to dive back into the archive a little bit. So you'll start to see some of the classic episodes from the early days condensed down. So if you don't want to dive right the way back in our feed, there's going to be short, punchy versions of those episodes appearing sort of every month. Maybe one from the archive every month and one short version.
Have we been doing this long enough? We have classics. That makes me feel old. Classic episodes.
Oh, remember the old microphones?
Remember, we didn't have a microphone to start with.
There's some good echoey ones.
Or we should revisit the vegan potato harvester.
You know, that should make the cut. That should make the 15 minutes of like hard-hitting science content.
Like 25 hours of rambling, that's it. That's my go-to, vegan potato harvesters. Or show me the Tommy knocker.
That was one of the most obscure ones.
But weirdly, for the life of me, I cannot remember the context of why I was shouting, show me the Tommy knocker.
It was the monster episode. It was the one with Tyler. It was the cryptozoology one.
Speaking of Tyler, have you seen that he's been in the news?
He has. I reached out to him to see if he wanted to make a comment, and he did get in touch with the journalist, and he said, depending on how that goes, he may make a statement through the Deep Sea Podcast. So, do you want to tell the story? It was great.
Well, the backstory here is Tyler's how would you describe? He's a
paleontologist and cryptozoologist, but
an activist for the truth, right? So he goes out to try and stop all this ridiculous sort of cryptozoology type of stuff, or at least put some science behind it. He hates misreporting. Yeah. He hates like sloppy reporting. Through a weird set of circumstances, he ended up as part of a major story about how the Loch Ness monster in Scotland might be a frog. Or a toad.
A big frog.
Big frog. And the poor guy has been like pulled
His whole life is dedicated to killing this sort of crap reporting.
It's almost as if he's upset somebody and they thought the only way to truly get back at a guy like Tyler is to put him at the centre of a monster theory or something. You know, it was just, I don't know. I felt for the guy, but at the same time I thought it was hilarious. If I were him, I'd get that printed off and above your mantelpiece. This giant frog haunts Scottish Loch.
I'll put a link to his blog because his blog is fantastic. It's really well researched. And yeah, he's talking about the validity of the Loch Ness Monster in one of his blogs. And as an example of there are things living at the bottom of the loch, far deeper than you'd expect. You don't expect like a pond frog the same species you see in your pond to be down over 200 meters, but it turns out they do. So he just used that as an example of there are things that live at the bottom of the loch. It's not totally devoid of life, but taken out of context, yeah, Loch Ness Monster might just be a big frog, according to, and his name's right up there in the the headline.
I was just chuckling. Honestly, I was sort of chuckling to myself when I saw that. I thought of all the people to get embroiled right dead center of a story like that. It's the guy who's like dedicated his life to stopping those stories. So very funny. Poor guy.
I'll get an update from him. I'll see what the journalist said.
Yeah. But speaking of news, there was another one. Did you see the one about the ugliest thing fisherman has ever seen?
Is it some poor thing that's been horribly decompressed?
No. Oh, no. You're going to love this. This is in Newsweek. The headline was, Mystery deep-sea creature dubbed ugliest thing fishermen have ever seen. And basically, this Australian fisherman has found something, right? And this whole article goes on about how it's awful and it's really, really disgusting and it's ugly and he doesn't know what it is.
It should be banned. Something must be done.
It says it appears a mottled pink-grey, like something out of Stranger Things upside down, and its eyes bulge out the side of its head, and its huge mouth, which takes up most of its face, contains rows of sharp teeth. And the fish can be seen to still have bait fish inside its mouth. I mean, it's just the whole thing. And then another friend of the podcast, Mr. James McLean.
After spitting out his tea.
he does a Vecchione on it. And after you get through all this rubbish, James is there just going, it's not a blobfish, it's a monkfish.
Was it this fisherman's first day? They're gnarly looking fish, but
they're fished.
No fisherman should be surprised by the existence of a monkfish.
Yeah, and you look at the picture and it looks a lot like a monkfish, but obviously this guy has never seen one before. It's amazing. It's just another one of those articles where it's just all talking about the flabby nose drooping over their mouth and all these ridiculous descriptions of this thing, and then we get right to the very end, and this is a direct quote. According to James McLean, senior fish curator at London's Natural History Museum, it is, quote, definitely not a blobfish, unquote. That looks to me very much like a monkfish, also known as an anglerfish, from the family Lophoidae, he told Newsweek. In fact, I bet money on it because I'm pretty sure I can see the lure it uses to catch prey just between the eyes. End of story. And that's it. Well done, James, for doing a mic.
Well done, James. There was a soft creaking on the line while he was speaking, which was his fist gripping the receiver. Yeah. Oh, this is where Scampi comes from. You can buy this fish at the pub. You can buy it at your local fishmongers.
It's not weird in the slightest, is it?
Well, not weird in the true sense. It's a really adapted, gnarly looking fish.
I must admit, I'm not a fan of monkfish.
To eat or just the concept of them?
When we've done jobs in the North Sea or off Rockall, North Atlantic on Scotia, we used to sort of get invited on there to do whatever we're going to do, but in return for the berths, we used to have to help process the trawl. And you'd be in this like fish house in the ship somewhere, and the hopper would open up, and a couple of tons of fish would come down the hopper, and suddenly it's like all hands on deck, and you've got to sort the fish into the species and all the rest of it. And in amongst a big pile of like whatever fish it might be, every now and again there's basically a fishy bear trap sitting underneath it, which is very much alive, even from 1,000 metres, and that's the monkfish. It's just got one big huge head, and it snaps at you. So I had some beef with monkfish, I'm telling you.
Because it's really reflexive, that jaw snapping. So they have a habit of net feeding as well. So even when they're like fighting for their lives, they can't help but eat all the other fish in the net. So quite often you'll pull them up and they'll have their jaws open, almost threatening you. And then at the back of their throat, you can see the tail of a mackerel sort of disappearing. So yeah, they're pretty intense. Saying that you can get them in a fishmonger's, and they do scare people. I think it was one of the Brummie fishmongers. What he would do is he'd tie a little bit of fishing line to the lure, which is at the front of the upper lip. So, of course, any kid runs into that fishmonger's and they're drawn immediately to the monkfish, and they're like, oh, look at this. And then the fishmonger would just pull that and the mouth would open.
Nice.
So a whole generation were just traumatized by this bored fishmonger in Birmingham.
Nice.
Do you have any more newsy stories? Or...
The only other one I saw which was interesting was discovering why deep-sea corals glow in the dark. Well, yeah, it's a bunch of scientists from Tel Aviv University are saying it's a lot of these corals give off fluorescence. So they use the downwelling light to excite pigments and give off these beautiful displays. And no one was really quite sure what they were for, but they reckon it's to attract in plankton, signalling their prey.
And they did some quite cool lab experiments, didn't they? There's like colour and pattern preferences to little prey invertebrates. There's certain colours that attracted them more, like the orange morphs attracted them better than the yellow morphs. Really weird.
But weirdly, having read the whole article, I'm still not getting where the deep sea bit comes into it. It sounds like it's 45 meters.
Oh, I think they experimented with those because quite a few of them fluoresce, and then they applied that lab-based stuff to the deep sea ones. But yeah, they've not observed it directly. Still a theory right now, but interesting.
The fluorescent stuff is cool. We should ask someone about that later.
We should. Yeah. Oh, wonder who that could be.
I don't know.
I'm quite enjoying the sort of paleo stuff. I'm quite enjoying the looking back in Earth's history. So the deep Atlantic was once as warm as the Mediterranean. It was 20 degrees 50 million years ago. And so ancient temperatures were reconstructed from the stable isotope ratios of basically tiny critter shells in the deep sea muds. So coccolithophores, things like that. You get a nice deep 3-meter sample of deep sea mud, and it's essentially going back in time, basically. So that's going to help us understand, again, elevated CO2 and the impact on our planet. All these mechanisms have existed in the past. But 20 degrees, in all of the Atlantic.
That's mad, isn't it? So I have to picture that.
Yeah, I've been having some ponderings for deep sea colonization. What would that have been like? Would it have been easier, or was this an anoxic period? Because you know how we were talking about in the deep sea and in the Med, warm water might make it easier for things to go deeper, but they still need oxygen and food. And
yeah, there are other factors at play as well. But generally speaking, a warmer deep sea should allow things to go deeper.
In that purely physiological sense. But whether there's a life for them down there is another thing. There was some nice footage from Mbari. Another nice example of, the more eyes in the sea capturing things, the more things you see. And I feel like this might be old footage that they've just re-released this month, or they've shared on YouTube for the first time this month, because it seemed the papers went back to 2021. But anyway, at about 1,400 meters down, so 4,500 feet off the California coast, they saw a squid brooding her eggs.
Ooh.
And it's unusual for squid to brood eggs. They tend to either release them as floating mats or to plant them somewhere. But there are some examples, and interestingly, all the examples of squid brooding their eggs are deep sea. So it's obviously a viable strategy when you're reproducing in the deep sea.
There you go. Good solid squid story there.
So the species was Bathyteuthis berrii, and there's some nice papers on it. So I'll put those in the show notes if you want to read more. So there was a new brine pool discovered in the Red Sea.
Yes, I saw that. Guys at Ocean X, yeah.
Yeah. Gulf of Aqaba, Aqaba. Apologies if I'm butchering that, but yeah, the small inlet to the north of the Red Sea. It's the main pool is huge. I thought this was a typo at first, but 10 square kilometres, and then with 3 minor pools around it.
Really? They are getting quite big. The one we dove on Suakin was quite big. Can't remember what size it was. The brine pools are awesome though, but we were never quite sure what to do with that data, because myself and Victor dove on the Kebrit brine pool a couple of years back, just before COVID, and it was beautiful, absolutely stunning. But scientifically, it's hard to know what to do with that, because it was so unbelievably void of life. There's obviously a hell of a lot of chemistry and geology going on there, but you can't really do anything if it's just video. So
it was beautiful to see, though, the way that sort of fake surface.
I mean, it feels like there's a haze, almost like a sort of smoky, sleepy hollow type of. I think of all the things I've done in my entire life, that's definitely one that sticks out as being the most surreal. It was like flying around on the set of Star Trek or something like that, on a different planet. It was bizarre. But I'm just not quite sure what to do with that.
Well, they're quite excited because they preserve the sediment really well, because of course they're pretty abiotic. So they reckon there's 1,200 years of geological history beautifully preserved at the bottom of it in its sediments. So it's quite a geology-based cruise, but they seemed very excited about what they found. That is a big thing to just stumble on.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Did you hear about the Java Sea off Indonesia glowing back in 2019?
Glowing?
The Milky Sea, yeah.
That's an old one, that. The Milky Sea thing was good 15 years ago.
It happens fairly regularly over that.
I remember it being a big story at the time, because some new satellite had enough sensitivity to actually film it, and you could see these big, long, bioluminescent waves across a massive area. I think it was off Africa or somewhere like that. It's in Indian Ocean, I think. But yeah,
this one was Java off Indonesia. Yeah, so it was that satellite that discovered it. It was more than 100,000 kilometers squared of the ocean was just glowing.
Nice.
And the satellite observations were published last year. And following the publication, the crew of the yacht Ganesha got in touch to say they were there. And they had photos from the surface and they sort of did a little bit of citizen science and tried to sort of figure it out. So it was a really nice like example of ground truthing of satellite data, a little bit of citizen science, and some like really wondrous things still being discovered. And the last one, I'm just keeping an eye on potential alien deep sea so that we can branch out and keep deep seeing in other planets. So the latest research indicates that Saturn's moon Enceladus may be a little less salty than Earth's oceans, but it's still another tick for being a contender for supporting life. So the signs are still looking good. Still might get some deep sea research on Enceladus in the distant future.
Well, let's go.
Yeah, pack up bags.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I'm going to see you on Monday.
Bye.
Bye.
What are you doing? Are you allowed to talk about it?
I don't know. I suppose so. We'll see why not. No, on Monday I am flying to Okinawa, and after my 1-year hiatus on the pressure drop, I am back as chief scientist again for the next 5 years, starting with Japan. So we're going to dive on the Ryukyu Trench, Aizu-Ogasawara Trench, Japan Trench, look at the Triple Junction, the deepest crinoid meadow at 9,000 metres, the deepest chemosynthetic site in the world. We're going to look for tracers in the cesium-137 from Fukushima. We're going to dive on the epicentre of the 2011 earthquake. It's going to be awesome. It's 2 months in 2 parts. I'm going to do the first month with one of my colleagues, and then I'm going to swap over with those two, and the rest of the scientific party are all from Japan. So it's a really nice big international thing. It's going to be great.
You've got documentarians along as well, so hopefully that'll be something that can be thoroughly shared down the line.
Nah, I can't stand film crews. I really don't. I'm just not interested anymore. They just do my nine. They will be making a documentary.
Did you listen to Edie's interview? She had a similar, like, never again. Fine for them to be on board, but never led by documentarians again.
No, I think as a general rule, I mean, we've been caught out a couple of times, but documentary and TV crews, this is like a PSA for young scientists coming into the business. They'll do anything in their power to try and steer what you're doing scientifically, and you have to fight them every step of the way. To make a documentary, they're just there to document what you're doing. They're not there to tell you what to do. Individually, these are all really nice people, but culturally, it's hard when you've got a film crew on. I shall try and maintain some presence in next month's podcast, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that yet. Anyway, so all this talk of fluorescence and bioluminescence and going from a whole episode on mesopelagic fish in the Twilight Zone and other bioluminescent oddities through Edie Widder and who followed on from Tracy's episodes, we should conclude this, don't you think, with
a three-parter.
A
story arc.
A trilogy, you might say. We need to follow up with someone who knows about the eyes themselves and the brains and colour, which we don't think about colour very often when we talk about deep sea. Everything seems to be a bit grey and brown and looks a bit sad, really.
Colour's kind of an afterthought, but it's really not.
There's nothing that fabulous in the deep sea. As a general rule, things tend to look a bit sad. It's like they haven't bothered to get dressed in the morning. But there are colour phenomena out there, so we should phone someone up who knows about that and interrogate them.
And who are we going to chat to?
I want to chat to Justin Marshall, who we've been to sea with. I've been to sea with him a couple of times. He's a really cool guy. He's recently sort of retired, but presumably not properly retired because no one does anymore.
It's academic retired, where you just work harder.
Yeah, and so he's a English professor, and he emigrated to Australia a long time ago. He's worked on a whole manner of things and has an absolutely fascinating career. There's no more point in me trying to explain it because I'll get him to explain it, so we should pick up the phone and give Justin a call. Right, so in the last few episodes, we've learnt quite a lot about things like the mesopelagic or the deep pelagic and open water fishes from Tracy's Saturn, and the mesopelagic being the largest habitat on Earth. And then with Edie Widder, we were talking about bioluminescence, which is probably the most common form of communication on the planet. This answers the question of why deep sea animals still have eyes, because obviously there's a lot of biological light. But the final piece of the puzzle is vision in the deep sea. How are these animals using their eyes, and in what way they're different from shallower eyes, and why do deep sea animals need to see at all? So today we have Professor Justin Marshall, who I was going to say from University of Queensland, but I think you're now retired. So Justin, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, good. Thanks. And I'm sort of retired, but believe it or not, I'm at a conference where I'm required to give a talk and a poster. So you can still say I'm at the University of Queensland, and I'm in the Queensland Brain Institute. Many people don't believe there are brains in Queensland, but there's a few. And yeah, still happily studying fish and wondering why they have eyes.
Excellent. So for the benefits of the audience, what is unusual about deep-sea fish eyes, the adaptations and so on? I mean, we know that they're sort of tuned, they're adapted to see in the deep blue, but physiologically, what makes them different from the eyes of animals we're more familiar with?
Well, the answer to that is actually not much. They're pretty much like fish eyes from the surface. They're pretty much like our eyes. Now, our eyes are called simple eyes because they have one lens at the front, and the lens focuses light onto the retina at the back, and we have this, the cornea, curvy bit you see at the front of our eyes, and that focuses the light onto the lens that focuses the light onto the retina and makes our image nice and sharp. In the sea, the cornea doesn't do anything because the cornea is sort of the same refractive index as water. So fish's lenses are a bit different, but whether it's a fish on the surface or a fish in the deep sea, they have these spherical round lenses and they have a retina at the back. So really the answer to the question is not that much until you start thinking about it. And then there are things in the deep sea that you need to do that you don't need to do on the surface. And there's a lot of things on the surface that you don't need to do in the deep sea. To cut a long story short, there's quite a few eyes that have become more simple. And then there's weird eyes that sort of have divided into two, and other eyes that have become more complicated. So they go in both directions.
So the four-eyed fish, for example, the one that it looks like it's got four eyes, but it doesn't. It has two eyes and it has two other eyes, but the second pair, if you like, are actually mirrors to deflect the light into the two real eyes. Is that something which is very specific deep sea, or is that evolved in any other animal?
No, that's very deep sea-ish, and there's a whole bunch of those. I've actually just had the pleasure of completing a paper with Professor Ron Douglas and others on exactly this subject. So read all about it soon.
Excellent.
Yeah, you can't wait, I know. And the reason for that is that if you think about these fish in the mesopelagic, you've talked to Edie and you've learned a little bit about bioluminescence. And of course, as we all know, as soon as you get below 1,000 meters in the ocean, there's no light left from the surface. So it's all bioluminescence. But when you're in that mesopelagic realm, let's say at 200 meters, there is light from the surface. And then as you sort of think about looking out to the side and looking down, it gets darker and darker. But there's still stuff there. There's still the bioluminescence. And lots of the deep sea fish at that level will have eyes that point upwards. So there's a famous fish called Apisthoproctus, and the proctus gives you a bit of a clue as to what it's doing. But we'll talk about that later. Its main eye looks upwards, but then it has this, or its relatives have this series of adaptations that then allow the fish to look downwards too. It's almost as if it sort of forgot about that bit. So it designed most of its eye to look upwards, and then it went, oh, hang on, I do need to see stuff down too, because that might be a predator coming towards me and exciting some bioluminescence. So they sometimes add what looks like a complete eye that's looking downwards. It's called a diverticulum. Some of them have their own little lens and their own little retina. And others have these sort of lens pad things that reflect or refract light into the eye, allowing the fish to have this sort of vision downwards as well, while focusing on the light from above. So it kind of covers all angles, if you like.
Yeah. So the thing that I was interested in, because I used to dabble in bioluminescence a little bit back in the day when I was a young lad.
Oh yeah, foolish.
And I know the vertical component to that, of course, the sort of downwelling light is one thing, but let's say you're completely beyond that. You're at 5,000 meters on the middle of an abyssal plain.
Yeah.
Something flashes. How far away are things seeing that? I mean, because we keep talking about bioluminescence is used for communication, and then everyone runs off a list of potential things it could be communicating. But how far is it emitting that, do you think, in sort of normal, crystal clear deep sea water?
Oh, it's a good question. One of the things that a lot of people don't realise is that vision in the ocean is limited by water. No animal in the ocean is going to see like we do, 100, 200, 300 meters away, a kilometre away. We can still spot things miles away because air doesn't attenuate light very much, or not as much as water. Whereas water, even if it's very pure, will cut light down. And then as soon as you start adding stuff to it, like particles or sediment or dissolved organic matter, then it attenuates very quickly. So most action in the ocean, whether you're in the deep sea or in the surface, is over just a few meters.
Is it as short as that, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a surprise. A lot of animals that live in the surface waters, especially, as I said, when you've got this organic matter in there, their whole life is conducted within possibly the space of the room which you're sitting in. I'm in a little soundproof booth, and that will be for very murky water. In the deep sea, the water does tend to be purer. It's quite clear. So it can be possibly up to 100 meters, that sort of thing. But that's a long way away for a little fish. And that might be an approaching whale. The dory in Finding Nemo kind of thing. Is that a whale a long way away, or is it a friend very close? It's quite difficult to judge distance in the sea also, especially in the deep. You see a flash. Now, was that a big flash a long way away, or was that a little flash very close? It's gone out now.
It doesn't necessarily have a shape or form, right? It could just be literally a flash or whatever. So.
Imagine sitting in a dark room and someone has a torch and they flash it, and you go, oh, it was over there, wasn't it? But it's gone out now. And then it flashes somewhere else in the room, and you're being stalked by someone in a dark room, which is a bit creepy. But that's what happens in the deep sea. These animals have to cope with these flashes from unknown distance and decide what to do.
Yeah, it's a bit creepy, but we all do it.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I want to talk about some of the stuff that's come out of your lab particularly.
Mm-hmm.
In 2017, you discovered a new type of eye cell in deep-sea fish, this rod-like cone specialised for dimly lit environments. Can you tell us about that?
I think anyone who can remember their biology back at school, you remember that the eye has these two types of photoreceptors, the rods and the cones. And in general, the rods are for dim light vision, or vision when there's not much light around. The cones allow animals in general to have colour vision. So, we've got 3 cones. We've got our red, green and blue. Hence, our whole world is RGB. In the deep sea, not that long ago, people thought, all of these fish are just going to have rods, aren't they? Because, rods see in the dim light, and it's dim in the deep sea, so they're just going to have rods. And that's actually true for a lot of deep-sea fish. They do just have rods. But then, we've found over the years that several of them have cones. And then you have to worry about the distinction between, what is a cone and what is a rod. Cones were labelled as cones because they're sort of cone-shaped. And rods are labelled as rods because they're, you guessed it, rod-shaped. But the distinction there is breaking down. A number of animals, including things like snakes, have sort of re-evolved colour vision, but using rods, not cones, and then other animals use cones for dim light vision. So it's become a bit of a mix and match situation. What we're finding increasingly in the deep sea is it's not as simple as we thought it was.
Yeah. So what about fluorescence? That's something I'm reading about today. Someone in Tel Aviv University has just discovered that deep-sea corals use fluorescence to attract plankton. And I read stuff a while back about some of these sort of more boring, sad-looking deep-sea fish may actually be giving off some sort of interesting display. Is that something you've worked on?
It is. I've got a particular, I'm not sure what the polite word is for this, but a particular thing about fluorescence, because one of the things that we do as humans is we like flashy stuff and we like things that glow in the dark. So we wave UV lights around and we see things that fluoresce. Go to any nightclub and you've got people wearing fluorescent tattoos, all sorts of things fluoresce. We actually use it in everyday life. So we use our Post-it notes or the highlighter pen that you might highlight a bit of text with. That has fluorescent dye in it. And it's a brighter than bright thing. It makes things stick out. And then as soon as you see an animal that fluoresces, you think, that must be relevant to the animal. It's trying to stick out. It's trying to be more visible. Except you need the light to excite it to fluoresce. And in the deep sea, there isn't much. In the mesopelagic, when you're in the sort of blue zone, it turns out that blue is quite a good fluorescence exciter. And in that kind of zone, it's possible that the blue light that's remaining excites fluorescent coral. And, I've seen this myself diving. You go to, let's say, even just 20 meters, you're scuba diving. And all scuba divers know that when you're at 20 meters, reds disappear because water filters out red first. So if you've got a red snorkel, it kind of looks muddy green or black. And you have to come back up to the surface waters to re-see your red snorkel. But then you see, hang on, that's an orange coral I've just seen. And that's a coral that is using the blue light to fluoresce. So there's a chemical process within the coral, within one of its pigments, that pulls in the blue light, it pulls in the blue photons, and then the chemical re-emits photons in the red or the orange. And it's always in that direction. It's always from shorter wavelengths, the blues and the greens, to the oranges and reds and stuff. And a number of corals, animals do this, but there is a whole bunch of stuff out there like fluorescent wombats. All right, they're not deep sea, but they don't fluoresce. Lots of things fluoresce just because
we can
they
make them deep sea.
Well, we could. We could take a wombat into the deep sea and see if it fluoresces, but it may not enjoy the experience. But no, there's stuff out there that just fluoresces. I mean, your teeth fluoresce. Is that relevant? Probably not. My fingernails fluoresce. All sorts of parts of human beings that fluoresce, which we can't talk about. But
I guess there's lots of these things that are
incidental.
And that's the word.
Incidental, wasn't it? We had several months ago. We had Marcel Jaspers on the show talking about biodiscovery and all these interesting biochemical compounds that deep sea bacteria give off, and he found one in the Mariana Trench that reacts to infrared light.
Yeah, not much infrared light
why?
down there. And so that's the thing. Don't get too excited about things that glow in the dark. because they may not glow in their natural habitat. But of course, there are some really cool stories about light in the deep. And it's almost certain that some of these jellyfish are using little fluorescent bits to attract possible prey. Same with coral. Coral's very closely related to jellyfish, so they might do the same thing. There's a good colleague of both of ours, Mike Matz, has spent a long time looking at things that glow in the dark and trying to untease this problem of, is it significant or is it just, an epiphenomenon, it's sometimes called. It's incidental.
Yeah. Huh.
Wombats, incidental.
Wombats in the deep sea, I'd pay for that. There's two stories I think I associate with you that I think are actually, there's a few, but a lot of them we can't talk about. But scientific stories, there are. Your career's been pretty damn impressive for all sorts of reasons. But the next two I'm going to pick out. The next two is. One is not particularly deep sea, but what the hell, the Manta Shrimp story, right? The Manta Shrimp can see in 12 colour channels. I think that's phenomenal, and how that sort of branched out into all sorts of different applications. I think possibly even the Blu-ray DVD.
Yeah.
Another one that sticks out is the colour-changing cephalopods are actually colourblind.
Yeah.
I think those two are stories which will go down in the great things about marine science.
To use a nerdy science joke here, are you ready for this? They are at two ends of the spectrum.
Well, hey.
One's got 12 visual channels, and the cephalopods only have one. So there's your two ends of the spectrum.
Nice.
And they're pretty amazing in both respects. Just to cut out of this for a little bit, there are deep sea stomatopods, the bathy squilla, but they, as you might expect, only have a single visual pigment. That's very sensible.
Right.
But it turns out they probably moved into the deep sea and lost the 12 visual pigments. That seems to be the direction that lots of evolution goes in. Things become more simple.
Yeah.
That obviously explains human beings. We're just becoming more simple as evolution progresses. Mantis shrimps, they do have these, the ones that live at the surface have these 12 spectral sensitivities. As I mentioned already, we've got red, green and blue, RGB. That's perfectly adequate for seeing most colours on Earth. Birds extend that to 4, and that allows them to see deeper into the UV, the ultraviolet. And, you can show theoretically that 4 really is pretty much what you need. So stomatopods, why do they need 12? Well, they seem to encode colour differently. They seem to do everything differently. They're just different little animals that want to be different. That's a very scientific explanation there, so you can tell.
Yeah, that's it. Done, nailed it.
Different, nailed it there. But then, as you say, it's the other end of the spectrum, the cephalopods that have this superb camouflage ability, completely colourblind. So how do they do it? And this includes things like giant squid, which we could argue are pretty deep sea, or at least mesopelagic, and other cephalopods that live in the deep. They have this single visual pigment. But then the cephalopods that live on the surface have a single visual pigment, despite the fact that they have available to them the full spectrum of light, and despite the fact that they put on body colours and shades and texture that allows them to disappear instantly. So how do they do that? Now, I played a mean trick on cuttlefish in Plymouth once with a colleague, John Messenger, and between visits to the pub, we decided to put cuttlefish on aquarium gravel. So we went to an aquarium shop and bought this weird coloured gravel that you can buy to make your aquarium look a bit more attractive. So we bought bright red gravel, and we bought bright yellow gravel, and we bought bright blue gravel. And we took the cuttlefish out of their natural murky green habitat and put them on bright yellow gravel. First thing, they don't go bright yellow. So they're not just matching a single colour, they don't go bright blue. But what do they do? And if you actually mix bright blue and bright yellow gravel and take a photograph with a black and white camera only has a single spectral channel, you can't tell the difference between blue and yellow anymore. And this is exactly what happens to the cuttlefish. So you put them on bright yellow and blue gravel, and they put on a body shade, which is just even all over. They don't try and match the texture. So what that tells us is that they're not seeing the colour contrast that we can. So they're not like us. They can't see that contrast. They believe they're on an even grey shade. So we fool them into doing the wrong thing with their body colours. Now, it still leaves the question of how the octopus, goodness gracious, how do they do that? And it's basically through evolution. So octopus and cuttlefish are superb at matching the intensity, the overall pattern that's provided by the intensity, and to some extent the texture, so they can raise their body skin to look like seaweed and stuff. And they do those three things, but they don't do colour. And all they have to do is recognise that the bottom of the ocean is usually kind of green and brown. It's not usually bright blue and bright yellow. Unless you've got mean experimenters playing with your head. So all they have to do is put on a sort of greeny, browny background colour, and they don't need to worry about not seeing it because they disappear.
I always thought they were actually mimicking it. They're just going for what they think it should be.
They just kind of do it because that's what evolution tells them the ocean floor looks like.
So are deep sea animals doing anything different in the brains? Are their brains evolved in any particular way to process this type of information? And the thing that I remember is Ron Douglas, who you mentioned earlier. I was on a trip with him. Someone had pulled up a midwater trawl, and in it there was a little octopus in there, and it was a little juvenile. And at that point, it was pretty much transparent, except it had one eye on the end of one arm and one eye on the end of the other arm.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sitting at dinner listening to Ron and the likes of Jochen Wagner and so on, arguing about what would happen if you turned one eye to look into the other eye and how your brain would even try and process that. So, what's going on in the brain department?
Good question. And well, actually, we've just started a PhD student here in Australia, and his job is going to be looking even harder into deep sea fish brains and to try and answer your question. So give him an interview in 5 years' time and he'll give a much better answer than I'm about to give. The brains are not that different. They're, again, similar to those of surface living fish. They don't have the bits that need to process colour, unless you're a weird deep sea fish that could process colour. We've recently described one that has, I think it's now 50 visual pigments. It's ridiculous. Anyway, cut back to brains. They're not that dissimilar. They can become simplified for certain areas that don't need as much light as the surface dwellers. But they have all the different, the metallencephalon, diencephalon, to use the fancy terms. The eyes go to the same sort of area of the brain to allow the brain to interpret images. But I'm kind of arm-waving, as you can tell. Really, the real answer is, although there's overall similarities, we just don't know. And this is the question that this student is going to try and tease apart. What really are those differences and what do they mean for the animal?
All right. Another question. Of all the stuff that you've done, what is the one animal that sticks out for you as being something really quite special?
Of course, I'm going to say everything in the deep sea is amazing.
Correct.
For me, and this is going to go right off subject, the most amazing thing I've personally discovered in the deep sea are adaptations for the fish to hear with. I work on hearing and the lateral line. But, I have worked alongside the people that have made these amazing discoveries about red bioluminescence. And, Edie Widder might have talked a bit about that. People tend to think of bioluminescence as being blue or green, but it actually covers much of the spectrum. And you've got these animals that have red bioluminescence, and they've got to adapt their eyes to see it. So the visual systems that these animals are using to see, it matches the light that they can produce. But then you do have these exceptions there. This ridiculous fish, Doretmus, it turns out it's got like 50 rhodopsins. Why do they do that? We just don't know. But for me, it's the exceptions. It's the weird things which really stick out.
What sort of colours did all those pigments cover? Were they all quite clustered, or were there some surprising ones?
It's a cluster around blue-green. And, being a rhodopsin, it's a rod-based pigment, visual pigment, and they tend to be in the middle of the spectrum, which is going to be the best for detecting light underwater. It's one of these things where the deeper you look, the more mysteries you find. My advice to any young scientist is, if you make a discovery, publish it and then do something else, because if you keep working on that subject, you'll find that your discovery was wrong. And I've spent most of my scientific career being wrong. I look back to some of my early papers and I think, oh dear, that was wrong. Joking aside, that's how science progresses. You do the best with what you've got at the time, and then you go, well, that's what I think. And then later you go, oh, hang on, that was probably wrong.
It just gets more and more correct rather than an absolute.
Absolutely. That's a very nice way to put it, Tom. I'm becoming more and more correct as I get older.
You're getting closer to perfection.
Politically, maybe not, but yes, exactly, closer to perfection.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you as well, if you don't mind, something's really interesting about you is you're a thoroughbred marine scientist, in that your father was Her Majesty's Curator of Fish at the British Museum of Natural History. He's quite the big cheese back in the day. That's your father.
He was one of the deep sea experts of the day, so he did other fish. If Her Majesty wanted to know what fish this was on her plate, she would phone Freddie Marshall and say, "Excuse me, Freddie, could you tell me what I'm about to eat?" I don't think this ever happened, but theoretically she could have done. But no, he wrote some quite famous books on the deep sea, and still in circulation today. I mean, you and I have used them when we go on expeditions. We go, oh, what did the book say about this? And we look up what my dad said. And so it's pretty cool, his books in my collection.
And your mother was the illustrator, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So family affair. So she did all the superb colour illustrations and black and white drawings of deep sea creatures, while Dad, talked about them in the book. It's been in the family. I remember going to the British Museum of Natural History and being allowed to poke the coelacanth as it bobbed up and down in its vat of formalin.
That's probably a bit bad for you, that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Something sunk in, a bit of formalin perhaps. And yeah, I followed in his footsteps. I tried to steer clear of the deep sea, but it's just so fascinating that you get drawn back to it. And it is nice to follow a bit of a family legacy there, but then most of my work's been on the surface, trying to avoid that.
Is there going to be a third generation of marshals? Do we need to watch out?
If we're going to talk the Sun line, as chosen music, he's a very good musician. He's aiming to be a classical composer. Anyone who likes Spotify has to immediately look up We Build Spaceships. They're a fantastic rock band that he's in, and he plays jazz, so he's turning into a really good musician. Yeah, he's just avoided the whole fish and science and smelly formalin side of things very wisely.
Talking of smelly stuff, you once told me that you twice lived underwater for quite some time in the Aquarius laboratory, and you told me some horrific stories.
I was lucky because this thing doesn't... Well, lucky? Is that the right word? This thing doesn't exist anymore. But the Aquarius Habitat was basically an underwater caravan on the Florida Keys. And, lucky marine biologists could go and spend 10 days underwater. It doesn't mean you have to be in the water for 10 days. You can duck up into this caravan, which was held at about 25 meters. So you can duck up into dry-ish air and dry off-ish. It's, in the 70s, if you remember Jacques Cousteau and the French, they were going to build underwater cities where...
His son is doing that right now, the next generation, which immediately made me think of your stories.
It's not going to work because you go mouldy. Now, humans are not adapted to being that damp that often, and you do start growing fungus. It's not pleasant.
Didn't you just describe it once as like having all-over-body trench foot?
Essentially, yeah.
Athletes, everything.
Yeah, and when I came up, I got what's called a skin bend. So I got slightly bent, not in the bad way, in that it affected my joints and nervous system. But I got a skin bend, which meant that a lot of the skin of my hands and feet just fell off all in one go. So I had this sort of foot pad which just peeled off, which was very unpleasant. But I dried it out and kept it in my wallet for a bit. But I gave it to a girlfriend. She was very happy with my foot parchment, that sort of thing.
Did anyone tell you about this before you went in? Did anyone say, by the way, in 10 days' time, the skin from your hands and feet is going to fall off?
There was a few hints in that direction.
But they didn't want to spoil the surprise.
No, exactly. It would have just taken away the pleasure of peeling off that single layer of skin in one go. It was fantastic. But yeah, it's not a place that humans are ever going to... It's like space, this idea. I'm going to go live in space. No, you're not. Space is very hostile. Underwater is a very hostile environment.
Yeah, the thing is, you're not living in space, you're not living underwater, you're living in tin cans.
Yeah, and it's a tin can which is damp. I definitely felt better when I was out in the water. And the good thing about the habitat was that you could spend 8 hours a day out in the water, and you just start thinking like a fish, and the fish sort of ignore you because they go, oh, there's that smelly thing that popped out of the tin can over there, and I'll just ignore it. So they do.
They don't always ignore you, though, do you?
There's one activity they like.
Activity they would wait for you.
Yes, I know exactly where you're going with this. Yeah, the angelfish, the coprophages, so-called, and maybe we should just leave it there, and people can look that up. What is a coprophage? But yeah, no, the sharks would come by, and you go, oh, shark. But it was a great experience, great privilege to live amongst the fishies and the other animals for that amount of time. So yeah, it was fantastic. Apart from the smell.
With the stoplight loose jaw and the red bioluminescence, do you think we would have noticed its visual differences if we hadn't had the bioluminescence as a clue? Because coming back to the fluorescence thing, I'm just wondering if there could be a communication channel between the same species, basically. I'm thinking of like coordinating reproduction and things like that. Could there be a private colour channel based on fluorescing from bioluminescent origin?
And it's an interesting question to ask, if you need blue light, and blue light is often used to excite fluorescence, and there's animals that produce blue light. Are these animals that have blue headlights actually looking for fluorescent things? And it turns out that bioluminescent organs, as you just alluded to, do fluoresce. So is it possible they can spot each other, or they can spot things they might want to eat using their blue headlamps? And that's a really good question. And we know so little about what's going on in terms of bioluminescent communication because we don't spend enough time there. We don't live underwater. As you said earlier, we wouldn't have learned about the red visual system of the dragonfish, etc., that use red light to hunt for prey, apparently. But do they also use red light for reproduction? I mean, after all, humans have red light zones, and maybe there's a common evolutionary...
Maybe that's universal.
Evolutionary common there. The red light is needed for reproduction. We should get off that subject quickly.
Abandon. as you mentioned, it's like, is that a little flash close or is that a big flash far away? And in terms of selective pressure, evolutionary pressure, like that's an important question for your survival. Are there any systems for ranging at all? Like I'm thinking about that one with loads of pigments around still the blue. Could you use a little bit of attenuation to gauge the distance of bioluminescence, or is it just too variable in its origin?
Yeah, the fish do have two eyes, and two eyes can be used to judge distance. That's how we do it. So, binocular vision allows you to judge distance. It's sort of an instant flash in the distance. That's really difficult. You really need, if we're judging distance for something, we're focusing on it, we're looking at it all the time, and, maybe we're reaching out to grab it. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's correlated with eye size. And you may remember this nice paper a few years ago by Eric Warrant and Dan Eric Nilsson, who sort of explained why giant squid eyes are so big. Here is the biggest eye in the world, the size of a dinner plate. And the reason they are so big is because they do need to see distant bioluminescence coming at them fast. And what this is a whale that's charging towards them, wanting to eat the giant squid. So sperm whales eat giant squid. And if you've got a really big eye, it's more sensitive. And maybe that sensitivity is correlated with how far you can see into the distance and how far away you can see bioluminescence. Even in their paper, they just went, yeah, maybe. No, this is an idea. One of those ideas you throw out there and go, okay.
There's no commitment anymore, People just need to commit to it. Just come up with a good idea and say it's right.
Exactly. We need a little bit more
confidence.
Germanic commitment. Well, this is the way it is, and that's it. But yes, we're too polite these days, Alan. We go, oh, possibly. Yeah. We're too English about it. Possibly this or possibly that. For goodness sake, make your mind up.
I've wondered as well with the brief flashes, they're so sensitive, or maybe the enzymes to sort of reset the pigment are a little bit sluggish. So similar to like when we get caught by a camera flash, even though the camera flash is a fraction of a second, it lingers in our visual field. And I wonder if they have almost a shutter style. They don't miss it, basically. They have an after image that they can maybe interrogate a bit longer to figure out where that was.
But yeah, I mean, that's possible. And there's even the possibility that some animals, those that live on the sea floor in the abysmal trenches that you both study, they might even be able to sit there and collect light over a long period of time, almost photon count.
Like building a heat map.
Yeah, exactly. And that's people have suggested that even frogs do that. So, a deep sea fish sitting really still might be able to slowly over a long period build up an impression of something going on over there and then move in that direction. So it's very sort of slow vision rather than the kind of vision that we're used to, which is the thing goes off and we look at it. Life in the deep sea is very slow. Everything moves very slowly. Metabolism is very slow. Some of the fish there only eat twice a year and then just sort of sit there waiting for something slow to happen.
A deep sea lizard fish that's been sat still for 4 months, seeing a very slow moving fish moving towards it, not as pinpoints of bioluminescence, but as a vapor trail. Because I've often wondered how they can sit still for so long, but then go off like a rocket.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a metabolic sort of ramping up. They see that something's approaching, and so they start to activate everything. They get the muscles ready, and it's readying the trap, basically.
All the wheels are spinning inside, and you don't really see it until, boom, then you're gone. We couldn't do that. If we sit still, especially at my age, if you sit still for too long and you get up, it's like, oh, my goodness, it's all creaky. It's very difficult to go from nothing to something, especially if you've sat still for 2 weeks. So, yes, there are some secrets there. There are some good questions, Tom. It's a very good question.
I should write these down.
Yeah, you should. How do animals do that? I did have colleagues that tried to measure metabolisms of deep-sea animals, but generally they just came out with the answer that it's slow.
Yeah, it's just less than other things.
Yeah.
That's been fascinating, Justin. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure, Alan and Tom. It's been great to talk to you about things that I love, deep sea vision. I've certainly learned something. I hope you have too.
There's another few things that I'm coming across at the moment in my own endeavours along the lines of what he was saying about fluorescence, that just because you've witnessed something doesn't mean to say it's relevant. I like that. If a fish could be capable of fluorescence, or like I was saying, that a bacteria might respond to infrared light, but it doesn't mean to say that it's of any significance to the animal whatsoever. It might just be a happy accident, but we're making it a big deal.
I liked his black light in clubs analogy, like the UV light in clubs. It's like some people have tattoos and face paint and clothes that are designed to react with the black light and look really cool, but also our teeth fluoresce, and that's just incidental. That just is a property of the chemicals.
Yeah.
You almost have to be careful reading too much into it.
Well, I was just thinking that recently because we're looking at some of the little amphipods in the trenches and stuff like that, and they obviously thrive at the very, very deepest points, which is fair enough. They've just evolved to do that. But then quite often when we pull the lander off the bottom, you'll see the amphipods still eating and still holding on for 3,000 or 4,000 metres off the bottom, and then they all suddenly drop off. And you sort of thinking and go, well, why would they have evolved the capacity to ascend to the surface at 50 metres a minute, right? Because it's just, why would you be able to survive that? Because it would never happen in real life.
And it does seem a hard point when they all fall off.
Yeah.
It wasn't like one falls off and then another one falls off and it's like the speed of it rushing up.
Yeah.
It reached this weird threshold at like 4,000 metres from where we got them that they all fell off at once.
Yeah. So I'm starting to think that maybe their extreme pressure tolerance is not a deliberate act of evolution. It's maybe just a happy accident from something else. Cope with something else that's happened to make them particularly pressure hardy. Because why would you invest evolutionary energy into developing a strategy that you would never come across? Similar to the fluorescence thing.
There's a few animals that overshoot it as well. We've been trying to figure that out. Why are some capable of going to pressures that don't exist on Earth?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're right, it is probably incidental based on other properties.
Yeah.
Oh, still lots to do. Still lots to think about.
I actually wonder what else is a complete load of nonsense.
Or just correlation. You know, correlation is not causation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think the octopus thing really fascinating as well. They've got an animal which is so heavily associated with some of the most abstract and bizarre displays of pattern and colour in the animal kingdom, and it has no idea. I love that.
It's like based on assumption. It's like, oh, this is probably sand. It's going to be around these hues.
But yeah, I don't fancy going on one of these underwater habitats. So not that I think I would ever go there, but the idea of being able to spend so much time scuba diving is worth peeling your hands and feet off at the end and then keeping your foot in a wallet.
And then giving it to a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, it is kind of romantic if you're weird.
We should have followed up with, is that girlfriend now your wife? Is she not? Interesting.
Whatever the answer is, does this person still have your foot skin?
Yeah. Full body athlete's foot.
Oh, yuck.
Hello, no one is available to take your call. Please leave a message after the tone.
Hi, I'm Claudia. I'm a university student from Sydney, and I wanted to thank you for your wonderful podcast and ask you a question about snailfish. How did they get their name? I know they have a sucker on the underside of their bodies, but what is it used for? And is it the only reason for their name? I shall be waiting in anticipation for your slimely answer. Thank you.
They're a super successful family.
Like the Kardashians.
Like the Kardashians, snailfish, the Leparidae, are found from like the intertidal, you can find them in rock pools, to being the sort of deepest living fish, at least that we currently know about. They have adapted their pelvic fins into a little sucking disc. Another family that do this are lump suckers. They're popular online. You'll see lots of very cute videos of baby lump suckers. Lots of character in those fish. They're lovely. So they developed a little sucking disc that lets them hold on to smooth rocks and to the fronds of kelp and seaweed. Interesting little tangent. Because they've lost a pair of fins, they have taken their pectoral fins, which are like the arm fins, and split them into two lobes. So basically they've split another fin so that it works like the pelvic fins used to work, because they've lost that set of fins. But anyway, they use this little sucking disc. The smaller intertidal ones tend to stick to the fronds of kelp. And when they're holding on there, they tend to curl their little body around and they look like a little snail. And that is where the snailfish name comes from.
So would you rather be a snailfish or a lump sucker?
There's a lot of charm to the lump suckers, but the more I look into them, the more I think I'd rather be a Hadal snailfish. I think it's all right. I think it's an all right life. They're really social. They're not food limited. I think occasionally they all get smothered and killed, but in between that, it's like the last days of Rome.
Yeah, during a seismic event, it must be a little bit grim, but yeah, all right. I'd prefer to be a lump sucker, but
would you?
Personal
just because
preference.
you like the name?
You basically, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just think snailfish. I've worked on snailfish a lot. I've spent a great deal of my career looking at the snailfish, and they're just so rubbish. I mean, it's impressive what they are and what they do, and it's great fun sort of researching them. But I mean, if I were to be a fish, I'd be like, nah. It's just so flimsy and fragile, and it's goofy looking, and it's got really beady little eyes, and it's
perfectly flimsy though.
The suckers on the deep water ones are kind of like almost regressing. I mean, they don't look like they can suck on anything.
No, I don't think they're using them.
No.
It's weird that they're still quite extensive. They're still quite large, but a lot of the musculature has faded away. There are other genera within the family that have completely lost their suckers. So yeah, it's obviously like an ancestral form, and then some more modern ones are starting to lose them.
I've never heard an animal scream like a snailfish, though. It's amazing.
They don't scream. After that, if anyone needs cheering up, just Google baby lump suckers, and they're adorable. I heard from another listener, hello if you're listening, Kate is a dog groomer from Colorado, US. And she said that she happened upon the podcast while looking for some deep sea scary creature stories, knew absolutely nothing about the deep sea going in, and didn't even really like water. Like, this was the whole point of starting the show. Like, she fancied a little bit of scary stories and a little bit of deep sea monstrosities, and then stumbled upon us, and yeah, now she's enjoying learning about actual deep sea stuff.
Does she listen to us while she's grooming the dogs?
That's what I was thinking. Is she trimming something that looks like a cloud with button eyes?
Just in case she is, could you insert some really loud barking Alsatian noises into this episode?
You want to terrify the floofy thing?
Yeah.
I'm not sure you've got the right nurturing attitude towards our listeners.
No, I'm not. I'm just curious to know whether you can sonically weaponize a podcast.
Nice. So she was exactly the sort of person we had in mind when we started doing the show, so that people like her could access like real deep sea science. So she went on to say, in your first episode, you guys shut down the idea that we know more about Mars. She was listening to the statistics ranted out and was shocked and very interested, and saying about the animals the more she listens. I think we've got a convert. So
excellent.
Hi, Kate. Welcome aboard.
Hi.
And you know what's coming. She especially likes Don. So there it is.
Does anyone like us?
No, it's not come up.
Every time anyone's ever said I really like ... it's always Don.
Of course it's Don.
He's like the Harry Styles of this boy band.
Good reference, mate.
I know.
So she's been sharing some deep sea facts with her fellow dog groomers.
There might even be some dogs strolling around Colorado knowing surprisingly amount of detail about the deep sea.
Just furiously barking at someone because they said we know more about the moon.
Yeah.
What's got into him?
He wants you to stop harking on about the moon, that's all. Is it too much to ask? It actually came up again. I honestly wish when we started this podcast I had a little book I could take a note of every time I've seen that written or said. It would be fascinating because it is relentless. It was even just the other day, it was a credible deep sea scientist in the news. One of the things she was like, oh yeah, because this is really important because, we know more about the surface of the, like, really? And it just won't go away. I think we're fighting a lost cause here. I think we'd be better putting our efforts into something else.
I've seen the tide turning, both on this and the blobfish. I think people like to be right on the internet. So now I'm seeing people, whenever anyone says that, I'm seeing smug people in the comments. Well done, smug people, by the way. You're leading the charge.
Yeah.
Actually, it doesn't look like that in life. Actually, that's a bit of a misnomer.
Good.
So I'm liking seeing a little bit of pushback on that. It's probably too vague, but we know more about the moon would have been a great title for the show.
Yeah.
Hello, this is explorer oceanographer Don Walsh, and the subject for today's program is windows in the sea. When using manned or unmanned submersibles, you need to be able to see outside. That's kind of a given, isn't it? So windows are needed, whether the eyeball inside is human or the lens of a camera. But these windows, or viewports, are also pressure boundaries, where the observer inside is at atmospheric pressure, and outside it's at higher pressures that vary with depth in the sea. It's an engineering challenge. The viewport material needs to be strong, so the trick is to have something that's also transparent. For over 2 centuries, glass was the logical choice. In fact, the only choice. A major underwater use for glass was faceplates for diver helmets, and this was fine for shallower depths, generally less than 200 feet, where the pressure differential between inside and outside was relatively small. From an engineering point of view, glass is very strong. That's the theory. But there are serious problems with it. It is unpredictable. This is mainly due to the fact that it loses strength when it is notched, and then can fail without warning. I can give you an example that we have all experienced, and that is cutting a piece of glass for a picture frame. You don't cut the glass with scissors or some kind of wire cutters. The glass cutter is a scribe. You make a scratch across the piece of glass, the desired measurement, and then you just tap the glass very slightly, and it breaks along that scratch line. And that's called a stress concentrator. Well, it's not very good for a window in the sea. If somebody happens to scratch it in some way, now you've got a stress concentrator, and it could fail without warning and catastrophically. But it was all we had until the 1920s, and that was when another stronger material was developed. It was called fused quartz, a transparent material made from very pure silica. By the late 1920s, General Electric was able to produce larger quartz glass viewports. Initially, the quartz was used for crystals in radio sets where the pieces of glass or crystal, if you will, were not very big, but it was General Electric's development in the late 1920s where you could make viewports out of this material. They were difficult to manufacture, very difficult, in fact, and harder to fabricate, but were much, much stronger than conventional glass. But fused quartz had some of the same limitations, namely the problem of stress concentrations. And again, you could get sudden failures. In short, it was tricky. But at Bermuda in the early 1930s, Dr. William Beebe planned deep diving operations with his bathysphere. It was a two-person manned submersible that was lowered on a cable into the sea, from a surface ship, of course. For his windows, he used three 3-inch thick fused quartz discs. He bought 7 of them from GE, and it's a good thing he had spares because 4 of them were destroyed during manufacture or installation. Nevertheless, with these windows, he bravely got to 3,028 feet in 1935. Dr. Beebe was indeed the first hydronaut. The last use of quartz glass in a submersible was by Beebe's partner, Otis Barton. In 1949, he dove his new design, the two-person benthoscope, to 4,500 feet. However, by then, fused quartz had been eclipsed by a newer and safer material called plexiglass. It was invented in 1933 by the Roman Haas Company in Germany. And it's too bad Barton was unaware of that because he would have had a lot safer viewports for his sub. It's not a glass. It's a plastic material. That means that it can flow under pressure, not like water, but very slowly adjust to pressure changes and that way avoid any stress concentrations. And it can also resist superficial damage. It's really impervious to superficial damage. You could actually take a knife or sandpaper and scratch it and do all kinds of things to it without any loss of strength. That's a marvelous material. In the late 1930s, plexiglass really made it possible for inventor Auguste Piccard to begin design and construction of bathyscaphe manned submersibles, which had unlimited depth capabilities. Glass or fused quartz could never have met this challenge. In 1960, the 2 7-inch thick acrylic viewports on the bathyscaphe Trieste worked perfectly on a dive to a depth of nearly 7 miles. There, the outside pressure was an astounding 8 tons per square inch. By the 1970s, hundreds of manned and unmanned submersibles had been put into service worldwide. All used plastic viewports. Well, while acrylic viewports were the beginning, it did not take long for entire submersible hulls to be constructed of massive acrylics, where the hull is essentially one big window. So inside, you are literally sitting in a hole in the ocean. We humorously call this experience being inside a people bowl. That is, you're in the bowl and the fish are looking at you from the outside. These were relatively shallow diving submersibles because at the time it was believed that the depth limit for acrylic hulls would be about 4,000 feet, where the outside pressure was about 1,800 pounds per square inch. In the mid-1980s, there was a related new development. This was the tourist submarine, which you can relate to, as I'll get to in a moment. They could carry up to 64 passengers on dives to depths not much greater than 100 feet. But you don't need to go more than 100 feet because at 100 feet, you begin to lose all the color definition in the ocean. And one of the things that the operators of the tourist subs do is mark your hand with something like red lipstick. It's nice and red when you submerge. By the time you get to 100 feet, it looks perfectly black because all the red color has been extinguished. So 100 feet is a good depth for a great experience. So now ordinary people without any diving skills had their own window inside the sea. These subs were fitted with more than 22 large acrylic windows and also a large hemispherical one in the front, half dome, if you will, for the pilot. While the typical tourist sub dive was relatively shallow and brief, maybe an hour, it was the large plastic windows that made it a special experience for passengers. Were they popular? Well, here's an example. The largest tourist company in this business is Canada's Atlantis Submarines. Founded in 1985, they have safely carried more than 12 million tourists into the depths. 12 million, think of that. No one injured. That's more than all the crews of all the military submarines that ever existed. It's a very, very comfortable and safe experience for the tourist. Today, advances in technology permit construction of acrylic hulls rated to a depth of 13,000 feet, or about 6,000 psi. So we've come a long way over the years in the knowledge of acrylic plastic and how to make better and stronger materials. Also, the state-of-the-art for acrylic viewports is now about 8 inches thick for full ocean depth ratings to, say, 36,000 feet, but the pressure is 8 tons per square inch. Well, I hope some of you can join the millions of us, because I've done a lot of it, who have had the experience of a tourist submarine dive. Believe me, it's a special thrill to be inside the ocean while looking through your personal window in the sea. So until next time, think deep, and thanks for listening.
Interesting, I found out the other day that we wrote that paper about why people don't care about the deep sea, and we published it in this IC's Journal of Marine Science, and I'll save this for another podcast if it gets to print, but somebody had written a reply to it, and that people do care about the deep sea, and so we had to write a comment back, and it's not, none of it's published yet, and it's a little bit weird.
This is proper academic arguing.
Well, this is what happens, because academics are a bit weird. If they see a paper they don't like, rather than just calling you up or emailing you and saying, can we talk about this, they will just writing a critique of your paper, and then you have to write back.
That's the system, though, because then that means the whole community is part of that debate. But it can feel strange.
So anyway, that's going to come out fairly soon. But in doing all that paper where we talked about the moon analogies and the blobfish and the tommyknockers, I believe, are even in that one as well. It's the only scientific paper I've written that references Star Wars.
So far.
Well, the editor told me it's been viewed or downloaded 5,500 times. That's a lot.
It's amazing. And we've heard as well that it's used in like tutorial sessions with undergraduates. It's used as like a discussion piece, which was absolutely the intention. You don't have to agree. It's just a jumping off point to talk about these things.
Yeah.
It's just to stimulate conversation.
And there's going to be more of it soon because we've had to respond to some interesting new points to be raised.
It's always fun to cite Pixar.
I know. Those two papers combined could be so funny if we were allowed to write an after dark version of it, rather than for a scientific journal. If we actually said what we wanted to say and how we would normally explain it, it would be really funny.
If only we had another medium with which we could share things in a slightly more lighthearted way. I'll have to think about that.
We don't know.
No, we don't. Hope no one's recording these calls. These are just for us. We should do a little special.
Maybe.
See what comes of it.
The same as every other podcast, except you've got your shirt off.
Is that what makes it after dark?
Yeah, it makes the
just
adult
shirts
version.
Off?
Yeah, just taps off everyone.
You might not be on the next episode. We'll see what comes of all that. Often adventures.
I'll try and send you some interesting anecdotes or updates and let you know how it's going. Yeah, quite looking forward to it.
Definitely. Sounds like a really good one. The whole triple junction and the whole multiple trenches joining. Why are things in one trench and not the other?
The backstory to this one is in 2011. Myself and my Japanese mate at the time were going out to do a particular study based on the Japanese snailfish and various amphipod things. And while we were loading the truck, the biggest earthquake in recent history rocked us something rotten, and we all got... It's a long, complicated story. Maybe one day on the podcast we'll talk about that, but it wasn't pretty, and the nuclear power station blew up and all the rest of it, and da-da-da-da. And then, of course, scientifically, we never got out. And now, what are we now? 11 years later, we're going, and we're going to finish it. We're going to finish what we started, only this time we've also got a submarine as well, so very cool.
And that concludes this episode of the Deep Sea Podcast. We'll deep sea you next time, and we abyss you already.
The Deep Sea Podcast is supported by our company, Amatus Oceanic. If you'd like to explore the deep sea for yourself, we can provide the technology and know-how to allow you to do that. Or if you'd like to bring the deep sea to your audience through storytelling, fact-checking, or presentations, we can help with that as well. We want the deep sea to be accessible to everyone.
Who's that calling at this time of day? It's probably the dog groomer in Colorado.
Maybe.
Oh, it's the dog groomer from Colorado phoning up to complain about the dog noise we haven't put in yet because for some reason the entire timeline is all fractured and been put back together the wrong way. So that's her complaining about what you're about to do.
And that, because we had the interview before we recorded the episode. So time's all wibbly-wobbly right now.
If you pick that up, you'll be talking to the dog groomer in Colorado.
Or me as a child.
Oh, that'd be weird.
Right.
Well, I'm glad that's over.
I don't like it when the outside world comes in. I like to pretend there's no one else. They're already getting complaints I haven't even published yet.
Yeah, that's what today. That's her phoning up saying, "Oi, what you doing?"
My little fluffy cloud went mental.
Oh dear.